again, one and all, for joining us, and it's a warm welcome from us here in Tracy. Uh, just a note on the Tracy Reflection. Our Tracy Reflection is a monthly venture to promote Christian thinking and understanding on issues that are relevant and contemporary. We at Tracy believe that our Christian vocation today calls for a critical dialogue between the Word and the world. All the more because we tend to uncritically accept the cultural patterns around us as acceptable, even when they can go against the very tenet of our faith. Perhaps that's why we felt over these last few months in Tracy that we need to ask ourselves more and more, how much Christianity do we actually think on issues around us? This is our 11th online reflection. Since COVID, of course, we have been having other events as well. And it's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Philip Vinod Peacock, who will be speaking to us on the topic of putting justice at the heart of faith, reflecting on ecumenism from an Asian perspective. Warm welcome, Philip. It's been 30 years since we met in UBS, and therefore it's a good reunion for us once again. Let me introduce Philip. Philip is an ordained minister in the Church of North India. He was previously the associate professor in the Department of Theology, Ethics and Social Analysis in Bishop's College. He currently serves as the Executive Secretary for Justice and Witness for the World Communion of Reformed Churches. I just, over the last few weeks, tried to glance through the books and articles that we know Philip, that you have written. And I should say you write very boldly and sometimes very non-conventionally, which is the need of the time as well. And today evening, even as it's time for me to renew my friendship with you, I am so thankful for the paper that you have presented for us. Just to give a small introduction of how I have understood the paper, as I read through the paper, I find two paradigms that you employ to state your theme. The Accra Confession that rose out of the experiences of the apartheid of the African churches, their own experience of neoliberal capitalism that was destroying their life and denying its flourishing, was also a reason why they came together as a church to understand how does faith address justice. And therefore they sought the support of World Alliance of Reformed Churches, what is called today as the World Communion of Reformed Churches, to respond in faith to the global economic situations. So it is the churches in Africa that came together to understand their situation, their apartheid, the injustice, and said that we as church would need to address injustice around us through our faith. The Accra Confession that forms the broader paradigm that Philip employs to share this paper today for us on how we look at similar situations in Asia, came out with 3 points. Firstly, that justice is a matter of faith. Second, that the church stands in solidarity with persons who are struggling and suffering. And thirdly, the unity of the church is critical and cannot be separated from justice. Thank you so much, Philip. I just enjoyed reading the paper, and I realized how after you took on writing on the Asian context, you started also dealing with the struggles that are there in our Asian context. You look through the issues in the Asian ecumenism, and finally look through the way forward. And when you look through the way forward, that is where you brought in the second paradigm that I would call as the Christian creed. As you conclude the paper, you use the Christian creed to share the way forward. The employment of the creed is so perfect because it is actually the confession of the church as a whole. So with these two paradigms that I see that you employ in bringing out this paper, it has come out so well for us to think about our own situations in Asia. Thank you so much, Philip. All of our participants have received the paper that you sent, and the time is over to you right now. You have 40 minutes from now to present your thoughts, after which we will take up questions, thoughts, and other reflections. You're muted, Philip.
I am muted, yes. Some
Yeah.
of the new language that we learn around Zoom. Thank you very much for that introduction and for that, in fact, fantastic outlining of my paper. I think you have said more than I could in the context of the text itself, and it is true. What I try to do in this paper is to encapsulate perhaps what can be called Asian Christian thinking, encapsulate in Asian Christian thinking between these two creeds. On the one hand, the Acre Confession, which is a foundational document for the World Communion of Reformed Churches today, and on the other hand, with the Nicene Creed, which is, of course, a foundational document for everyone who would call themselves Christian. However, the effort is to move beyond confession, really to see how we can be a confessing church, in the sense that perhaps Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the confessing church that arose out of the Barmen Declaration wanted to look at it. With this, I will proceed to read my paper and perhaps offer some bits of explanation here and there as I move along. But perhaps I would like to start with introducing the World Communion of Reformed Churches for those who don't know it very well, and that is really a lot of people. The World Communion of Reformed Churches initially began as an organization in 1875, when some churches in England came together under what they call the Presbyterian form of governance. This group of people, this group of churches kept expanding until they formed the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, which was very much part of the ecumenical movement. The World Alliance of Reformed Churches is ecumenically and in Christianity known for two things. One is its work that it did around the question of apartheid. It was one of the first world communions to name apartheid as a sin and a heresy, and even went as far as to dismiss two-member churches who would not confess that apartheid was a sin. It was also the church that, it was also the communion that brought forward the whole idea of justice, peace, and integrity of creation that was later on taken up by the World Council of Churches. So this is a group that has seen justice as being integral to living a life of faith. Today, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, as we call ourselves, is found in 105 different countries, bringing 235 churches together and representing 100 million Christians across the world. This makes us the third largest Christian communion. After the Catholics and the Orthodox, the WCRC is the third largest Christian communion. Though having said that, what we popularly say is we are the third largest Christian communion, but nobody knows about us. So perhaps this kind of thing helps people to know what we are and who we are and what we do. We were located in the Ecumenical Center along with the Lutherans and the World Council of Churches till 2014, when we moved out and came to Germany. And this is where we have been for the last 7 years now. So anyway, onto this paper that I would like to present. So this paper that I'm going to read seeks to answer the question, what does it mean to speak of faith and justice from an Asian perspective? What is uniquely Asian about an Asian faith? And perhaps reflect on how Asians have imagined faith and contributed to the larger ecumenical discourse. If one was supposed to speak about Asian ecumenism, though, firstly, one would have to consider what was unique about the Asian continent itself. And we know that the idea of Asia is an ambiguous idea. If we are to read the relevant literature, geographically, the boundaries of Asia remain ambiguous, and several continue to debate whether or not countries such as Russia and Turkey belong to Asia. In fact, if we think about it, a continent is described as a large mass of land surrounded by water, which Asia isn't. In fact, there has been a separation of Europe from the larger body of land called Eurasia, and it has been claimed that this has been done on a cultural rather than on a geographical notion, which of course then begs the question, if Europe, which is far smaller and less culturally diverse than the Asian subcontinent or the South Asian subcontinent, why is Europe a continent and South Asia a subcontinent? Of course, which then goes into the politics of and the possibilities of geography as being political. And I can see, I'm looking at Lausanne now and thinking about what he thinks about some of these things. Unlike Europe, that has constructed a history with extremely violent consequences that have claimed a common cultural and sometimes racial root, while at the same time accounting for difference, both linguistic and cultural, Asia has not imagined such a past. Although, and perhaps also because, Asia has played a pivotal role in the European construction of itself. Asia in the modern discourse has been constructed as ambiguous other, as perhaps Edward Said would suggest. While I would not deny that this also has been the experience of both Latin America and Africa, it has not happened to the extent that it has in Asia. While there have been efforts to create a pan-Asian identity politically, economically, and perhaps even within the context of theology, it is my assessment that these have not succeeded in creating an Asian consciousness, as perhaps have similar attempts within the context of Africa or South America. Secondly, diversity. Related to the issue of Asian ambiguity is the experience of cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity. Asia is a continent that occupies around 30% of the landmass of the world and hosts around 60% of the world's population. That is extremely diverse culturally, ethnically, politically, and religiously. There are a number of different ethnic groups that live within Asia, like in other continents. Asia has its own multiplicity of ethnic groups that are further divided along lines of language and dialect. However, what is important to note is that because of the size and the population of the continent, this diversity is probably more than elsewhere. Likewise, there is also a diversity of political systems and processes that range from multi-party democracy on the one hand to monarchies and dictatorships on the other. Culturally, it's difficult to speak of an overarching Asian culture. This is particularly true while speaking of traditional cultural practice, food, myth, and ritual. Within the context of Asia, there lies an extreme diversity of culture. A couple of years ago, I was in Japan for a conference on racism, and there was someone from South America present there who looked at me and asked me whether this was the first time that I was in Asia. The question struck me as being, I couldn't wrap my head around the question. And of course, that is also because within the political West mindset, Asia refers to East Asia, the subcontinent. Near East Asia, West Asia is not counted as being Asia at all. However, we should not exaggerate this cultural diversity that is in Asia as well. Living in a globalized world, it would be naive to suggest that there's little similarity between the culture of West Asia and East Asia, for example. After all, cultural globalization has meant the proliferation of homogenized cultural artifacts across the globe. Dubai does not look or act, or tries to look or act any different from Seoul or Tokyo, or even New York or Frankfurt for that matter. However, what is important for us to note is that the elements of this homogeneous culture are not essentially Asian, but are reflective of a global market system which has become the driving force of culture today. Interestingly, many of the cultural artifacts of modernity are literally produced in sweatshops around Asia. And so Nike, Puma, the Gap, Under Armour, all of these clothing brands that you will see people wearing so proudly around themselves, found around the globe, are made in the sweatshops of Bangladesh, of India, of the Philippines, in China. And this goes on from clothing to electronics and everything that brands or marks us as consumers in the world today. Most importantly for our purpose, however, is the multiplicity of religious expressions that are to be found in Asia. Asia is, after all, the home to several major world religions. The list would include Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Sikhism. And this would perhaps take us to our last important factor, namely minority. While Christianity was founded in Asia and the name Christian first used in Asia, one would have to admit that the church in Asia is a minority, with the Philippines being the only exception. In most countries like in Asia, Christianity is a minority religion, which I believe is one important factor for us to consider when we speak of the significance of the Accra Confession for Asia. The Accra Confession is a foundational document for the World Communion of Reformed Churches, the organization I work for. Arising out of the experience of apartheid, the Accra Confession was first proposed by the African churches who wanted the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, what the WCRC used to be called, to respond in faith to the global economic situation. The confession, accepted at the 2004 General Council in Accra, named neoliberalism as destroying life and denying its flourishing. It further called for the covenanting for justice in the economy and for the earth. The confession goes on to make the following 3 points. Firstly, that justice is a matter of faith. Secondly, that the church stands, or really should stand, in solidarity with persons who are struggling and suffering. And thirdly, that the unity of the church is critical. And this idea of unity cannot be separated from the idea of justice. While one would acknowledge a wide diversity in Asia, I believe that there is a certain commonality of experience among the people of Asia. And we shall make some attempt to speak of the commonality of this experience by mapping the Asian context. Firstly, the struggle against colonialism. If there is a common experience in Asia, it would probably lie in experience of colonialism. Almost every Asian country has been colonized, with perhaps the exception of Thailand. Colonialism has had a deep and devastating impact on Asia, the effects of which continue to be seen even today. While Asia and Europe probably began the transition into modernity at the same time, both of them did this in entirely different ways, one as a colonizer and the other as a colonized. Colonialism impacted Asia economically, politically, socially, and psychologically. On the economic front, colonialism meant nothing but the raw extraction from Asia for the wealth creation of the West. This extraction was devastating for local economies who, as a result of colonialism, were overturned to become producers of raw materials for consumers in Europe. And so you see, entire economies are dependent on this still. I mean, we must ask the question, why is Sri Lanka, such a small country, the largest producer of tea in the world? They are producing far more tea than they can drink. Or why is India, for example, producing so much sugar? Where is this going? And for whose benefit is this? On the political front, for the colonized, colonialism means the loss of the right to self-rule and self-determination. In the latter part of the 19th century and in the 20th century, the opposition to colonial imperialism took on the form of the rise of nationalism, which attempted to confront empire using the Western entity of the nation state. The process was not without its own issues, and new studies on nationalism are discovering that it has often served to crystallize the dominance of the local elite that colluded with colonial interests and colonial ideology for their own purposes, even if they opposed colonial imperialism. The end of imperialism, therefore, for several powerless groups across Asia merely meant the handing over of reins to the new masters. On the social front, what happened was that the colonial powers colluded with local dominant communities that either served to ratify ancient hierarchies, recreate them in new ways, or create altogether new ones. Essentially, colonialism meant that more vulnerable groups, particularly women, peasants, small artisans, indigenous people, and those who lay at the bottom of social hierarchies became even more vulnerable. On the psychological front, colonialism was constructed and imagined as a sense of loss, defeat, and even emasculation of the colonized. Colonialism was, after all, not just the extraction of wealth, but also the contestation of ideas within which certain ideologies, scientific rationalism, for example, were privileged over all others. The sense of loss and emasculation continues to exhibit itself in various ways, including the glorification of violence, colonial constructions of knowledge, and the imagination of a glorious past that has its own problematic today. There is therefore significant work being done by Asians today in the field of post-colonialism that is trying to deconstruct some of this. The struggle against poverty. Another common experience across Asia would be the experience of poverty. In India, official statistics tell us that 29% of the population lie below the poverty line. The question, however, is how that line is drawn. What defines the poverty line? In India, the poverty line is defined as the amount of money required to purchase 1,200 calories of food, the minimum daily requirement of an adult. To put it in another way, in a conservative estimate, 29% of the population are starving. The numbers of those who are malnourished are far worse. Dietrich and Wielanka remind us that poverty is not just the lack of cash to buy minimum food, but it manifests itself in malnutrition, poor environment, polluted air and water, poor clothing, poor housing or no housing at all, lack of space, poor health, poor education, and so on. Poverty means hunger, disease, and despair. It means children dying of malnutrition. It means child labor, bonded labor, and unhealthy work at low wages. It means dependency and abuse. It means a breakup of families in search of work. It would be naive for us to suggest that poverty in Asia is a result of colonialism. Such a view is too simplistic and monocausal. However, what we must realize is the logic of the present economic order that places value on profit over people has only served to worsen poverty. The situation is made worse by state and non-state actors such as international financial bodies and transnational corporations pressing for a particular economic model that would benefit the powerful but would wreak havoc on the lives of the powerless. And actually this is playing itself out now in India. I mean, we've had this major crisis in times of COVID, shortages of hospital beds, shortages of oxygen. And one of the reasons is India's health budget is about 2% of its GDP. Now, how did that happen? That happens from 1991 onwards with the structural adjustment program, which forces India to spend less on public welfare and schemes, and rather to allow these areas with allow for life, that is education, health, housing, to be pushed into the private sector. And so we find less and less governmental spending or state spending on what actually makes for, the flourishing of life, so to speak. I mean, and I know that this is a story that must be resonating with each one of us personally, because if anyone got COVID or even any other major illness, it pushes you into poverty because you're forced to sell your house, sell your car, sell your land, sell your productive assets just to meet rising hospital bills. This neoliberal agenda is being pushed through structural adjustment programs that seek to privatize, liberalize, and globalize the economy, subsuming all things to the logic of profit-making. Unemployment, reduction of workers' rights, and increasing gap between the rich and the poor is a result of this. Curiously, capitalism has taken on two specific forms in Asia. The first is what can be referred to as authoritarian capitalism, where through state interference, a capitalistic agenda is being pushed. This either takes the extreme form of China, who pushes the agenda of capitalism with military power, or the example of India, where the state openly acts in favor of corporations and against the rights of people, as has been amply witnessed in the rulings in the Bhopal gas tragedy case, as well as Vedanta and POSCO Corporation's case in Orissa in India. Interestingly, capitalism envisages the reduction of the role of the state, leaving the economic system to the invisible hand. And so we see that, there is this actually ideological thing that capitalism works with the private hand, but it really doesn't. It involves the hand of the state. The second form of capitalism found in Asia is what Naomi Klein would refer to as disaster capitalism, where corporations and governments move into areas devastated by natural or human-made calamities to introduce a neoliberal agenda. Examples of this can be witnessed in the war-torn areas of Iraq and Afghanistan, or the tsunami-struck areas of Indonesia or Sri Lanka. The struggle against environmental degradation. Linked to the struggle against poverty is also the struggle against environmental degradation. Reliance on a growth-based economic model system has meant an increasing pressure on the environment. Climate change has affected several parts of Asia in different ways, including increasingly extreme weather, floods, drought, loss of species, and rising sea levels. While the debate between the developed and developing country of the world continue over carbon emissions, fact is that Asia has not only suffered because of climate change, but inasmuch as it also continues with its economies of phenomenal growth, it also continues to contribute to the problem. The struggle against violence. Another common feature that can be found around Asia is the levels of violence, whether it is war, armed conflict, state violence, terrorism, insurgency movement, human rights violations, structural violence, or gender-based violence. Violence is endemic in Asia. Of particular significance for Asia is religious violence, whether it is between sects of the same religion or two religious groups, and the struggle against internal hierarchies. While we speak of the context of Asia, we must not also forget the presence of internal hierarchies that exist among Asian communities. Structures like caste and patriarchy continue to discriminate against and cause violence towards millions of Asians. While we have looked at the Asian context by raising several specific issues, it is important for us to note the connections that exist between these various elements, all of them working together in certain places to further the systems of injustice that exist. And so in the next section, we'll look at the question of Asian ecumenism. The ecumenical movement in Asia has charted a very specific course, particularly in the way it sought to engage the church with society. Because of its largely minority status across Asia, the church is in a unique position vis-a-vis the state and the national question. This, of course, places Asian Christians, churches, and the ecumenical movement in the possible position of having a prophetic voice, calling the faithful to engage with the world. Asian ecumenism is a call to the faithful to engage with the world. By doing so, it firmly locates itself within the tradition of the prophets. Biblically, there are two kinds of prophets. The first is those who were court prophets, who also excelled in offering a theology that was in support of the status quo. Now, in the writing of the Kairos document in South Africa, they recognized that there were three kinds of theology. The first is state theology, and apartheid is an example of state theology. But then they also spoke of church theology, and church theology is that theology which uses the right words, which names a problem, but is not willing to put itself at risk, because ultimately it benefits from the status quo. And the third kind of theology is prophetic theology, a theology that seeks a transformational agenda. There is also an alternative tradition of the prophets who opposed power and questioned the structure. These prophets often lost their lives in the process. The Asian ecumenical tradition has consistently called people into the latter prophetic tradition, particularly in relation to the economic and political system. Asian ecumenism has encouraged us to struggle with economic systems contextually and pastorally from the perspective of justice, ensuring that our economies serve the interests of the people and not the large multinational corporations. This is perhaps evidence in the work of the Christian Conference of Asia that has worked for economic justice, particularly through an interfaith lens. Other examples can be found in the liberation theology of Sebastian Kappen, Minjin theology that emerged of the Korean Peninsula, and the life and the witness of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. In the Asian context, however, the gospel came to the people as part of colonial enterprise, and it was in many ways a tool of subjugation. In this sense, the gospel that was presented was a depoliticized gospel that called people to engage with the world and not to disengage with the world and not question the violence of the system. Therefore, an otherworldly faith was encouraged and cultivated. This understanding of the gospel still continues in Asia, with many believing that being a believer necessitates withdrawal from the world. The struggle of the Asian ecumenical movement, however, is to call attention of the faithful to the real crisis of the world and sees engagement with it as a legitimate act of faith. It calls the believer to understand that justice is the very substance of faith. And this calls us to the second point, that the Asian ecumenical movement calls us to faith-based stance for justice. Asian ecumenism calls us to faith-based stance for justice. For Asian Christians, justice is very often reduced to a question of ethics. Acts of justice are seen as what one should do because one is a Christian. Therefore, it is not uncommon for Asian Christians to get involved with charity work. Several churches take on different projects in which they find the right thing to do. Asian ecumenism calls us to understand that justice is a matter of faith. It is a matter of confession. It is the very heart of God. To put it in other words, it is not Christians who should be involved with acts of justice. Rather, it is doing acts of justice that make us Christian. This has perhaps been the legacy of the global ecumenical movement, that faith and order is disconnected and distinguished from life and work. And I'm talking about the two arms of the WCC that came together. Faith is seen to be the work of the first and ethics the work of the second. Yet the distinctive contribution of Asian ecumenism is that it has called us to understand that justice is not dealing through faith. Rather, it is justice that lies at the very heart of what we do as Christians. Resistance to empire. At the present moment, there's been a lot of work being done ecumenically regarding the question of empire. Yet this is not something which is necessarily new to Asian ecumenism. Though the word empire was not always used, resistance to forces of imperialism has been significant for Asian ecumenism and indeed to faith traditions in Asia. This is both Christians and those belonging to other faiths too. Having been brutalized by colonialism and neocolonialism, Asians have a real experience of what empire is. Many Asians see the word empire as a legitimate nomenclature for all that has been destroying their lives, livelihood, community, and environment. However, Asians also realize that in the modern world, empire cannot be embodied by a single nation, however powerful. The feature of modernity is that power cannot be found in individuals or organizations, but rather in systems. Asians would define empire as systems that accumulate power to serve the interests of a few at the cost of many. As greatly increased distance between those who make the decisions and those who suffer them. While we have spoken about how Christians in Asia are a minority, what we should also mention here, that in many countries in Asia, they are the powerless minority. Christians in Asia are poor, dispossessed, women, Dalits, Minjung, indigenous. They're not the ones who discern the signs of the times. They're the ones who experience them. They're the voices that the Accra Confession calls us to hear. It is Asian Christians, whether it is in the sweatshop worker in Indonesia, the sweeper in Pakistan, the Dalit in India, the indigenous person in the Philippines, who have experienced the violence of empire. The many poor and the many faiths. Asian ecumenism also recognizes the global ecumenism does not pay adequate attention to the reality of religious pluralism. There is a question of the many living faith traditions that our sisters and brothers draw from while they seek to make the meaning of the world and to transform it into a space that offers justice and peace for all. While it is necessary for us to speak of justice as being a matter of faith for those of us in Asia that live in a multi-religious context, we realize that this cannot be reduced to being a Christian project. The difficulties of seeing justice as a matter of faith is that it becomes a barrier to joining hands with secular movements for justice. And if we are to create another world, then this joining of hands is a necessity. The need for us in Asia is also to open up spaces by which we can relate to other faiths and work together for the sake of justice. This openness calls us to be able to listen to the voices of those who lie outside the walls of what is traditionally called the church. We as a church have the notion that we have all the answers, that we know how we are to transform the world. And we are fantastic preachers, always telling others what to do, rather than being able to learn from others. A theology and spirituality that's directed towards the other is not one that tells the other what to do, but rather one which is willing to listen to the other, to hear and learn from the other. While it is true that what Paul is speaking of in prophecy is that the church be willing to speak to power, to name and dismantle the structures of power that oppressed others, perhaps we cannot do the same today without understanding our own location in the midst of power. The global church is no longer a minority being hunted down by empire. And we must understand that the church today, the global church, is empire. We are powerful and responsible for much exclusionary violence around the world. While this may not be the immediate experience of Asian church, inasmuch as the Asian church also connects to the global church and is part of global initiatives, it also becomes true for us. And so we live this dual reality of being a minority, but being linked to this powerful global reality as well. Fact is that we have privilege and we have to be able to unlearn our privilege. In fact, I would argue that we have to unlearn our privilege and actually be able to see our privilege as our loss. That precisely because we as a church are in positions of power, we can no longer speak the truth, and that we're losing out on salvation as a result. We need to defamiliarize and unlearn our notions of power as individuals and institutions as well. What we have to do is learn some humility and seek and set to learn from the very people we intend to teach. And now to the way forward. And I go through the 4 marks of the church as outlined in the Nicene Creed. Perhaps the Asian ecumenical movement can learn from what we confess in the creed as being the marks of the church. And though the creed sought to fix doctrine, a process which has a stamp of imperialism on it, it is also an ecumenical effort which underlined the idea of finding unity through the creeds. What is perhaps required then is a radical reinterpretation of these creeds. That this radical reinterpretation of this could possibly enable us to chart a way forward. 1. The first word of the creed regarding the church is that the church is one. This is, of course, that means that when we speak of the church, we are referring to a united church, a church that is one body of whom Christ is the head. This, of course, means that the church has to be a united church, but the question that must be answered is what kind of unity are we aspiring towards? If we look around the world today, we would, of course, realize that unity in itself is not necessarily a good thing. After all, there could be unity for evil and injustice. The G7 nations, for example, are united in their forcing of a market economy on the rest of the world. Likewise, the coalition of the willing is again united for the sake of war. In India, we have the Sangh Parivar that is united again for parochial interests. The point being made here is that unity is not an end in itself, but rather we must always question the ends that unity is serving. When we claim that the church is one, we are claiming a unity of which Christ is the head. This, of course, implies that the unity of the church is directed to the ends that Christ himself taught us. That is to say, we are united not for exerting power, but rather for the sake of powerlessness. Again, we are not united for the sake of evil and injustice, but rather for the sake of justice. The unity that the church calls us into is a unity of and for the sake of the oppressed and marginalized of the world. When we speak of unity, there are 2 metaphors we can think of. One is, of course, a metaphor of the ladder, a unity which moves upwards. No doubt, this is the unity that is sometimes conceived of by the church, a unity that is upheld by the hierarchy of the church. This is a hierarchical sense of unity. But we can also conceive of unity in the sense of a circle. This is unity in the sense of equality. The metaphor of the circle lets us see unity of the church in an open and inclusive way. After all, the circle can always expand itself to let people in a circle. A circle can grow in a non-hierarchical way. More importantly, however, it is when we stand in a circle, we are always on the peripheries and not at the center. The united church is a church which should be on the boundaries of society. Not a powerful church, but a church of the marginalized, a church of those who are on the peripheries of society. Lastly, the idea of being one leads the church to consider the reconciling ministry of the church. We are called to be peacemakers in the world. The role of the church as one is a call to those who are divided, who are separated, who are warring to be one. The second affirmation we make about the church in the creed is the church should be a holy church. There are 2 senses in which the church holy can be used. The first is the sense of being separated. It is a sense of the church being separated from the world in the sense that the systems of the world cannot prevail in the church. Therefore, being holy means rethinking hierarchy, caste, patriarchy, class system. This means that these unholy practices cannot find their place within the church, nor can it be the true members of the church partake in such a system. Rather, we are called to be separate from such things of the world. The other sense of being holy is a creative holiness. It is the church that is in the world and not of it. The stranger and the alien church that challenges the world to move from imperialism to shalom, from the acquisitiveness of global capitalism to the simplicity of sharing and living in community, from the ravages of occupying colonialism to the spirit of participatory democracy. Being holy means rooting out and challenging all that is unholy, all that denies humans from full participation in life, and pulling out all that destroys or prevents the image of God in us. In this sense, holiness also means upholding all that promotes the wholeness of life. Catholic. The third affirmation of the church is that it is a Catholic church. The word Catholic refers to the universality of the church. This means that we, as being members of the church, cannot draw a line that determines who is or who is not a member of the true church of Christ. Our Lord told us there are other sheep, and therefore we must understand that when we speak of the church as being Catholic, we are referring to the mystery of the church. We cannot speak of who is part of and who is not. This is not for us to decide, for we cannot know who Christ has called his own. This means, of course, that the church is an inclusive community. It means we cannot exclude anyone from the fellowship of the church, not on the basis of race, color, gender, or belief. But the church is not only called into this manner of passive inclusivism, where we are all welcomed into the fellowship of the church, but we are called into an active inclusivism, where it should be seen as a mission of the church to make heard those voices that have been hitherto been unheard or been intentionally kept silent. This means that we affirm that the church is Catholic. We affirm our solidarity of God's work of liberation in the world. It means we stand in solidarity with all those who are kept silent and enable these silenced voices to be heard. Therefore, the church should hear the silent screams of women suffering under domestic violence, of Dalits who are being crushed by their landlords, of tribals who are having their land snatched from them and their culture destroyed. The last affirmation we make about the church is that the church is an apostolic church. This means we are a sent church, a church with a radical mission to turn things upside down, look at things in a different way, and turn the world upside down as well. This means challenging hierarchies and letting the first be last and the last be first. A church that is called to serve the world and not a church that is called to be served. We must question, however, who it is that we are called to serve. And what we must understand is that we are not called to serve the interests of the rich and the powerful of the world. It is here that the church must ask a serious question. Whose interests does the mission of the church serve? Whose interests do our educational institutions and hospitals serve? Are we just helping the rich get richer? Are we committed to upholding the status quo or challenging it? By way of conclusion, ecumenism across the world, as in Asia perhaps, should not only be seen either as a program or even as a project, but as a process which is continually evolving and changing. Yet the question arises of how should ecumenism change? It should change contextually, arising to meet the challenges of each age. Asian ecumenism, because of its specific locations outside of both Christendom as well as Christian majoritism, located in a multi-faith context and arising out of the struggles of people, is particularly enabled to offer something to the wider ecumenical community as well. A way of engaging with word and the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I took a lot of time to read your paper to get into the depth of what you were sharing. And I mean to say this, that it is important for us to spend more time into your paper to really understand what our calling is as a church for our society today. Even as I open this time for questions, comments, and reflections. But to start off, there were two statements that you made about the church that could easily abuse our positions of power and which could stop us from actually no longer speaking to truth, and we will actually lose out our salvation as a result. And therefore, when you spoke about the unity of the church, you said that we are not united for exerting power, but rather for the sake of the powerless. I think these are very strong statements. Somehow, on reading your paper again and again, I thought it is important for us to redefine some of those words like holiness, the meaning of the church, calling, and many of those aspects. I think we have caught up with many of the jargons that we have lost the actual meaning of what all this means for us in our context. Thank you once again for bringing our context alive. Thank you so much for also trying to share where we as a church have failed in many ways. and where we as a church need to be prophetic in its truest sense. Uh, how do you respond to this again? The church always having a temptation to take on power when actually, while taking on to power, we lose speaking about the powerless to the people in power.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. And I think that is a temptation throughout the ages. That is a temptation both we as individuals and as institutions face. It is really the heart of the temptation that Jesus faced, to be powerful, to turn bread, stones into bread so people could eat, to jump down from the pinnacle so people
Sure.
will think he's some kind
Yeah.
of superhero, and really not the way of the cross. The way of the cross, the kenotic cross, is actually the giving up of power. And this
Yes.
is a continuous temptation we will face, and something that we always have to continuously resist. I think that the way to do it is to always be open to listening to what the powerless have to tell us.
Very true.
And the work of the church then is to create these spaces where the powerless speak. I mean, actually,
You're
let
right.
me correct that. To create the spaces where the powerless are heard, the powerless are speaking, we are not listening to them.
Exactly.
So I think this will be the work of the church and perhaps enable us to overcome this temptation.
Thank you. There are a few questions that have come to me. I will read that. And meanwhile, if you are free enough, you could even unmute yourself and ask the questions. The first question that comes to me is from Andy. He asks, what is the status of the Asian ecumenical movement engaged in prevailing ethnic disability and injustice in the region? What is the immediate and forward plan and partnership vision? Let me read this question again. What is the status of Asian ecumenical movement engaged in prevailing ethnic disability and injustice in the region?
Right. Okay. So there has been considerable work that has been done and is ongoing. And now I would like to use ecumenical in the wider sense of the term, not just referring to a particular
Sure.
strand of Christianity, but really in what all the churches have been doing. And I think there has been significant work. Particularly in Asia. I mean, whether we speak about the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, where the churches were involved. The Church of Bangladesh, for example, was very involved in creating hospitality and welcome to Rohingya refugees, to what is also going on in the case of West Papua in Indonesia and the church's struggle against let's call it now, for now, the human right violations that are taking place there. There has been effective church's struggle and response to this. However, I think perhaps not enough, not well known enough, and perhaps also a more connected and cohesive attempt is necessary. Peace and reconciliation work with the lens of justice is very hard work. Very, very hard work that needs to go into the root causes, that needs to look at a sustainable future for all parties concerned. And in some places, the church is rightly positioned to do this. In other places, I mean, again, going back to the Rohingya struggle, I mean, among certain of our member churches, for example, in the Chin areas, they were genuinely scared of raising a voice against what was happening to the Rohingyas because they felt it was the Rohingya first and Chin next. So there are these other also issues where the church itself is this ethnic minority which is being persecuted, chased out, at the brunt of violence. And negotiating peace from such a vulnerable position is also very, very hard. So I think perhaps if we want, I think more needs to be done, and we need to work together in an integrated way to, work harder in some of these issues.
Yeah. So in a similar manner, I think the Indian church at large also hasn't spoken very boldly about the struggles of the Dalit community, even the rights of the Dalit. I think I'm just trying to see where the connection would be. There's a question from Shantanu Datta before I go to Dennis J. Surya. how does genuine conversion contribute to the regeneration of the mind and the pursuit of justice? How does genuine conversion contribute to the regeneration of the mind and pursuit of justice?
Right. Thank you. I think actually this is a fantastic question, and I would like to link it to what you said earlier. See, I think what conversion actually enables us to do, and I'm speaking purely sociologically now, is conversion offers us the ability of constructing for ourselves a completely new symbolic world that is outside uh, of the prevalent situation that we are in. So for Dalits, for example, who flocked to the church from say from 1875 to 1925 in hordes, the church was an attractive option for them. Christianity was an attractive option because it offered the possibility of now creating a symbolic world which was not vested in the hierarchies of caste, but perhaps promoting an alternative new future in which people could see themselves as equals. So within this context, I think that for the oppressed particularly, conversion offers this radical possibility.
Yes.
And given, given the other efforts of the church and Christianity and Christ himself, right? I think this gives us really the possibility of a new society that is based on equality. If we simply take the act of communion, the Lord's Supper, eating from one loaf and drinking from one cup, which breaks every notion of purity and pollution, that is such a powerful act. And we welcome people into this act. So I think this is, has really powerful potential. And this is why we find right across the world, right across time, although very often the church is the religion of the oppressor, the oppressed have also turned to it. I mean, this is so clearly seen in the context of slavery in North America.
Okay.
There was the Christianity of the slave owners, but there was the Christianity of the slaves as well, of the enslaved, I should say, and which was a radical expression of Christianity.
Before I go to the next question, I know that Shantanu Datta would prefer to come back to ask his question again, but I want to go to Dennis J. Surya. Can you ask the question?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Satish. Thank you very much, Reverend Philip. I think I really appreciated not only this talk by you, but the earlier one that I also heard. I think it was UBS alumni that had hosted. I recognize the scholarship, the wide referencing, and a strong commitment in the paper to the theme of justice and so forth. And I think it's amazing that someone from UBS is able to produce such a paper. So I think this changes the dimension of the traditional. Satish, you were shaking your head.
Yeah, you're putting us down.
I was going to say the same thing.
No. I thought so because when I graduated from UBS in 1981, I visited UTC, and I forget which was that professor who spoke to me. He really looked down at me like I was a Sunday school graduate and not a Bachelor of Divinity from Sarampo. I mean, that's just a side point. Now, my comment, while I agree to the thrust and emphasis of the paper, I'm just wondering whether you also need to look, or you have looked at, that ecumenism in Asia is on a downward trend, that its influence in the church, whether it's the mainstream church or the wider church, is in many ways part of an old legacy of the WCC and so forth. Why I raise this is because the post-Luzon movement has raised many evangelical churches and Christians who are at the heart of championing issues of justice. Like if you take Malaysia, I think most of the key Christian members of parliament all come from the evangelical churches and have been in the forefront of political reform and change. And also, I think post-Luzon brought about huge numbers of evangelical churches, some from mainstream, but largely from the charismatic movements that set up all the alternative services that are locally funded by Christian community, in community work, work among the poor, and so forth. So I'm just wondering, in putting the ecumenism movement in that context, whether you have a comment on that. I'm not saying it's totally irrelevant, the Council of Churches, the counterparts in Malaysia and so forth. But I'm looking at other parts of Southeast Asia where they are not as significant, or I might not be in those groups. I want to raise two other points that your paper didn't cover on Asia, and that is that there is a sizable Christian business community. It's actually the Chinese diaspora that is rich, that is powerful, that is in business, that is in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, that have tremendous influence in the economy. Do you see them as just collaborators with faith and capitalism, or there is a movement for fight against corruption, ethical, responsible business, and so forth? So that's a strong movement. My final comment, whether you took into account the rise of Christian populations in certain countries in Asia. Not much, but it's significant. I think the Christian population in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, I think a sizable number of the Singapore cabinet are actually Christian. South Korea is another example. Taiwan would be another example where the church is actually not poor and sidelined, but are these new movements potential for change in the Asian context? Likewise, the church in India, the affluent Christians in India, in other parts where there are sizable Christian populations in Northeast that have influence in government at the highest levels and so forth. So whether that makes a very strong position for Asia that we need to harness. That's my thought, Philip, in this context.
Thank you. I mean, firstly, let me start by saying I feel so sorry for that UTC professor who could not see scholarship and different faith experiences in someone else. I mean, this is a genuinely sad thing if you think about it.
But that was 40 years ago.
Well, to tell you the truth, it has changed. It really has changed, but not significantly. And I think what I would like to bring to this is that most normal Christians across India, okay, and this is the place that I know best, really have their feet in the ecumenical, I mean, if you want to make such a division, in the ecumenical camp, as well as the evangelical camp. This is true of all of us. I belong to the Church of North India. It's a so-called ecumenical church. We are members of WCC and all these other things, but we are also very, very evangelical as well. And so the faith experience of Indian Christians really, and I think this may extend to Christians across Asia, is that we have actually quite wholesomely wedded both these kind of traditions. This is really part of who we are. Much of our early Christianity, in fact, coming to these countries arose out of the evangelical movements as expressed in the missionary movements of the 19th century and early 20th century. So we have our, we stand on both, firstly. So yeah, having said that, I think what we must also do is make a distinction between political evangelicalism, as perhaps expressed in some sections of the United States of America, and evangelicalism as a faith experience that many of us have gone through. I, for one, hold very dearly to me my roots in UBS, which was responsible for my early faith formation, but equally in the Lutheran seminaries that I studied in India, which didn't own this evangelical experience in the same way that perhaps UBS did. So I would like to say that firstly. Secondly, I think you're very right in saying the ecumenical movement is on a downward dipping now, no doubt about this. It's relevant across the world. It's relevant for many. It's actually irrelevant really for many reasons. I would like to see the reason being that it's lost its radical edge for justice. The ecumenical movement that fought so hard against apartheid just doesn't be able to come around to any, it's playing safe at the moment. It's more interested in church unity rather than actions for justice. So I think there is definitely something that you are saying here. And I am really trying to use ecumenism in the broader sense of the term, where it is a certain Catholicity of Christianity that finds itself in all these various different faith traditions. Yes, of course, historically and even now, so-called evangelicals, and I put this in inverted commas, have been at the forefront of justice struggles. I mean, the abolishing of slavery movement, the struggle against caste system in India, continuing work for gender justice and violence against women still continues very strongly in evangelical and so-called ecumenical traditions as well. So I think there's a great amount of commonality which needs to be explored. But yes, yeah, you're certainly right. Now, going on to these other two questions that you have, let me start with the second. It recently, very recently, like let's 2 or 3 days ago, came to my attention, and I wanted to actually ask Raju Bhagwat more about this because he's in this call and is in Cambodia. There have been an exponential church growth in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and these places. So, I mean, really exponential church growth. On the other hand, what we are noticing is that in China, for example, of course, the CCC, the Christian Conference of China, has had a very pro-national approach. Very pro-state, Chinese state. But now, even with the house church growth movement in China, we are finding that same leaning towards Chinese nationalism, which is something that we must ask, what is happening over here? So there has been church growth in different parts of Asia in different ways, but are relating to the status quo and empire in different ways. And these ways are not all the same, they are different in different places. In South Korea, we know that the greatest movement towards church growth happened because of the church's involvement in pro-democracy struggles. After that pro-democracy struggle ended, church growth has plateaued or even dipped a bit within the context of South Korea. So in South Korea, there is a connection between the church standing for justice and its exponential growth there. So, but there are different examples in different parts. Now about Christian businesses. I may be very wrong here, very wrong. But it is my impression, and you'll have to correct me, that many of these Christian businesses are really in the area of small to medium businesses. They are not the large industries that make for the billionaires. But this is in the hand of small things, really small industries, small even retail, these kind of areas, which has accrued to the community a certain amount of wealth, but it's not an exponential amount of wealth. But I think two things we need to look at when we're talking about this. Firstly, how is the money made? How our work is being treated. I was once taken to a fish working industry in a town just outside Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu. We were invited to see this place. This was in the 1990s, and it really, in my imagination at that time, looked like something that was outside of India. I mean, the beautifully manicured lawns. When you entered the preparations for hygiene, you waded to small pools of water. You washed your hands by using foot pedals, so absolute disinfection. Wind curtains, and in this place were children, 8 to 16 years old, working 12-hour minimum shifts to pack fish for export to different countries. Sometimes these children were, if a big haul of fish came, like a bonus was they would be allowed to watch movies, but then made to work 24-hour shifts. Most of the children were migrants from Kerala living in hostels on that campus itself. And this business was owned by a most devout churchgoer. He came every morning, prostrated himself before the altar, and mopped the altar area in a show of humility. He probably gave a lot of money to the church too. Now, if our faith doesn't make a difference to our everyday practice of how money is made, there is something wrong. And so it is my hope that these Christian businesses are actually being enthused with better business practices on the one hand. And secondly, I mean, and this is something else that we are involved with the World Communal Reformed Churches, but along with other ecumenical organizations, including the World Council of Churches, we have a campaign called the Zach Tax Campaign, in which we are basically arguing that an encounter with Jesus should make you give back. And so arguing for a wealth tax, a tax on companies that have made large amounts of profit during and because of COVID, tax on polluters, and working towards a system of reparations as well. So I think if you have a Christian business, and this is a sizable growing community, I think these ethical values must be ingrained in how business is actually done.
Philip, can I come in? I think there are a few more questions and our time is limited.
Yes.
Otherwise, I think we would continue with this discussion. I have a question from Reverend Dr. Simon Samuel, Principal of NTC. He asks, is our sense and understanding of justice, that's biblical justice, helping us to come out of our own selfishness, looking after our own self-interest? How much is the church ready to speak and act on radical discipleship towards building an egalitarian society within the church? I think what you just spoke, we can continue with that into this question. Yeah.
Okay, so there are certain things that I really like about this question. I mean, some points that stand up. I mean, this conversation of self-interest and coming out of our own selfishness. It was very interesting to me in reading Adam Smith and his talk about self-interest, that everyone, if they serve their own interest, then the economy works as though with an invisible hand. And one of the things that really stuck with me was this biblical verse from the Philippians, which says, each one of you look after not only your own interests, but also the interests of others. And that seemed to me to fly in the face of this whole question of self-interest. Is the church ready to speak and act on radical discipleship? I like this idea of radical discipleship. That, I mean, this is what I believe Jesus calls us into, a radical discipleship that looks towards transforming the world. I think this is what the church should do.
Yep.
Now, whether we are doing it and how do we do it, that is a question I think we must answer together. I'm sure that all of us believe that this is what the church should do. And we need to get down to the brass tacks of doing exactly this.
And therefore, the question that Jamila Koshe asks is, the global church is largely patriarchal, and in the church and in teaching and practice, and even in Christian homes, how does this fit into our idea of justice? Yes.
Okay. So this is again a fantastic question, right? So yes, I mean the simple answer, yes. The global church is largely patriarchal. In fact, we can describe the church, the global church, as a last boys club. Everywhere else is becoming more gender inclusive, excepting the church. And unfortunately, and feminists have been arguing this for a very, very long time, that the first chains of patriarchy are actually forged in the home. It's through processes of everyday socialization that starts from the home that we know that patriarchy is actually being formed and constructed. And even more so, this is bolstered by the ideological and theological legitimacy that is being offered by our churches for this, whether it is in Sunday school about how we tell the story of Adam and Eve, how we prescribe what songs that we sing about what little girls and what little boys should be doing, in all these ways, or even in actual representation, where we see that the minister is a man, whereas almost in every church, the congregation is a majority of women. We reinscribe these ideas that the church is, or leadership in the church or leadership in general, is largely a male space. And this needs to really change. We have to reread, for example, our Bible, our theologies, our spiritualities. We have to begin to listen to women and what their experiences of the church are, and then account for the number of silenced women in our societies, but also in our scripture, and reread some of these texts from this perspective.
How do we listen to women when they are not there, when we don't allow them to speak? When we don't want to listen to them. I don't know, Dr. Jamila Koshi, would you like to would you like to build on that question? Are you there? I'm not sure if she's here. Ronnie, is Jamila here?
She's there, but
yeah, for me, I realize what we state, that we are the last boys club, is true. But when will we hear them when we don't want to see them? We don't want to see them in spaces where we can hear them. And therefore, I think we need to go beyond what we are saying. There's certain things that we need to think through. For all of us, at least, who have joined today, if this is starting from home, as Dr. Jamila says, and then on to our own teachings, our own practices. If patriarchy is present, the idea of patriarchy is present in all these places, I think we would continue to speak, but we will never see them. And therefore, I think we need to hear them and allow them to speak more. Thank you for that. Yeah. I come back to Raj Mandal's question that he raised very early in reading this paper as well. How has our Asian experience of powerlessness, being on the margins, being a minority population, and being a persecuted church shaped our theology?
Oh, I think tremendously. Tremendously has shaped our theology, whether we speak about liberation theology, to Minjung theology, to Dalit theology, to feminist theology that emerges. Being on the margins has really shaped our theology in one way. In another way, of course, I mean, I think what we should not enter into is a competition of victimhood. This is not helpful. If we're just going to see ourselves as victims and unable to transform or change things around us. So I think both of these things has happened. We have had, on the one hand, this radical transformative agenda, but on the other hand, a sense of powerlessness that comes from just imagining ourselves as victims. And I think perhaps the way forward lies in between these two things. On the one hand, we have to account for yes, these things are happening. There are historical and continuing things that have happened that makes the situation so. But on the other hand, we are not devoid of agency, and we are capable of transforming the situation around us. How we do this, that is a question. And like I said in the papers, I don't think that we can do this on our own. We need to join hands with like-minded people, with civil society actors, with making policy change. These things are very, very important. Also, I think perhaps we need to do some good social analysis, in the sense that many times the church is not only persecuted because it's a particular religious minority or a religious community, but there are several axes that work towards this. So, for example, in Kondhamal, we know that much of the violence against Christians there was also on the axis of caste and indigenous people. It had a colonial history that did census taking in a particular way. And we have to account for all these different axes when we begin to understand our reality. And so I think this is perhaps one way in which we can move forward with this.
Yep. Thank you. Let me take Satya Chakrapani's question. Are there models where church has been in the forefront of justice and equity? Or if that is our quest, how much of the culture plays out, and is our church ready to face it?
Well, I think there's several models in which the church has been at the forefront of justice. I will give you two, and these are not from India. I mean, although they are fantastic Indian examples as well. I mean, one is, like I already mentioned, in South Korea, the church was really at the forefront of the democracy struggles. So much so that, the police lined up both sides of the entrance to the National Council of Churches in Korea, and anyone entering or exiting the building was beaten by batons. But the church struggled in the context of a very authoritarian regime and fought for democracy to the extent that many senior theologians and pastors within the Presbyterian Church of Korea, the Methodist Church in Korea, the Presbyterian Church in the Republic of Korea speak of jail being their home. They went in and out of jail so often that they speak of jail being their home. The second place where this is working out today is in the context of the Philippines, and how many pastors of the the UCCP, I mean the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, as well as the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, have been at the forefront of against a number of human rights violations that are taking place in the Philippines, so much so that there is an actual situation called red tagging, where they are being accused of being communist and supporting a leftist agenda. They are being rounded up, they are being killed, assassinated, put into jail, exiled, all kinds of things happening in Philippines today. And really at the moment, Philippines really needs our attention and prayer because of the drastic human rights violations happening over there, and the church actually being on the forefront of this. So there are very viable examples of how this is happening and how the church is resisting and struggling against injustice. And these are just two examples I've given. There are examples in India, there are examples in Pakistan, there are examples, all over the place where this is going on. I think we need to learn from this. And the question of church and culture is this is a really big question. I think it's Niebuhr who did fantastic work about this. And I don't know, we have to find our way. Niebuhr himself, I think it was Niebuhr. So he sort of ends with church and culture and paradox, right? So somehow, there's this creative tension between both. I'm more of the opinion it's Christ over culture, in the sense that the gospel must be the yardstick by which we judge our culture. But that's my personal opinion. I do not impose it on anyone, but I think that the gospel must be the yardstick on which our culture is judged.
I think, Philip, you're right. The gospel is the yardstick, but the problem is how you define the gospel. So for a person who defines the gospel in a particular way, the way he would define the culture would also be so different one from the other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I did miss a question. I'm returning back to that. Thank you for two of you who reminded me on that. This is from Ram Surat, who has done his PhD on caste system in India as well. How do you see Brahmanism? Uh, or has Brahmanism been yoking colonialism in Asia? Is that the question? Has,
especially in India. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
can you just explain that question, Ram Surat? Yeah.
Uh, as a paper was read, and mostly the colonialism, how has impacted socially and economic area and then psychologically. But in that connection, how Brahmanism and caste means, that means casteism, especially Brahmanism,
Mm.
has impacted in those areas. How it has become the friend means it is an integral part of the capitalism in India. Basically, the capitalism is a daughter of Brahmanism. If you see here in India, if you go higher upper caste, the more class you will be a high class. Much money will be there. So you come in the lower class, you will be less class system. Capitalist, you will find a very less capitalist. Means even no capitalist. So casteism, sorry, casteism. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Brahmanism has the basic root of the capitalism here in India. So you see that mostly we, especially in theologians, they much speak about the colonialism, but colonialism has been the very own brother or own sister as a yoking going together with the Brahmanism in India. So how do you think the Brahmanism has created this kind of impacted the social aspect of our life, economic aspect of life? Without uh, Brahmanism in India, this type of disparity would have not been, I believe. It is my personal thinking. So how
Okay.
do you think about and economical, what do you call it, ecumenicals, how they have played the role regarding this Brahmanism and casteism to take it further in the world level?
Right. No, I completely agree with you. Totally. In fact, Ambedkar, he very specifically notes that the twin evils in India are Brahmanism and capitalism. And it's not two separate twin evils. These two have converged with each other to form a formidable system of social hierarchy in many ways and historically. What we know historically is that when colonialism entered, there was a distinct shift of power that the dominant castes in India took absolute advantage of and garnered all the social resources and land resources towards themselves at the cost of others. So there was a dramatic shift, that happened at this time that changed and empowered the dominant castes in particular ways at the cost of everyone else, and particularly Dalits in this case. We know that the Macaulay Minute, for example, when it called for a class of Indians that would act as a buffer between the colonialists and the rest of the native population, that it was the dominant castes which definitely took on this and, took advantage of Western education, took advantage of the colonial project to their own advantage. And the minute that they found that they were being hampered now by the colonialism, then they started an independence movement. So we know this is very, very true. I mean, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, continuously wrote to the British as your most obedient servant. So we know that, this has definitely happened. And they took advantage of it and to the cost of the Dalits. And really, if we have to speak about the Indian society, not using the lens of caste as an analytical tool to understand what is going on, we are doing a big disservice. So I think, yes, I think we need to have a deconstruction, particularly in India, about the way that caste has appropriated capitalism, has used it for its own advantage, and to the detriment of Dalit communities right across. So, yes, I completely agree.
And therefore, Philip, would you introduce the book Dalit Theology in the 21st Century?
Thank you so much. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
yeah,
Okay, whatever. I can't
yeah,
show it. It's not
yeah,
showing here.
yeah.
Well, I I found this a delightful experience, I must say. Thank you. It was a very good experience of learning for me. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. I think, if anything, we have shown that an ecumenical evangelical alliance in the classical senses of the terms is perhaps what is necessary for the transformation of our societies on the one hand. But more than that, that really we are on the same page about this. So yes, thank you very much. It was a real delight. I have learned a lot. And thank you to Tracy and everyone, especially Satishta, for inviting me to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, Philip. It's been such a delight to meet with you once again and to also read through your paper and then look at the whole context of Asia. And I believe a paper in itself wouldn't be the end. I think what should come out as our reading of the paper is to understand if the church in Asia, or even the Indian church in particular, would come together, understand the injustices that are around us, and even ask for the Indian church to study on these issues and come out with a confession that is very strong and very sort of confessional statement that we should make for ourselves. Once again, thank you, Philip, for joining us this evening. We would look forward to have more of you in the future reflections as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Philip, for your paper and, of course, the discussion. There were many points that we could have raised as well. I think for those of us who don't come from a theology background, there's again another lesser gradation as compared to UTC, UBS, and then those of us who talk from the non-theological background, it's even lesser. But we continue to speak our minds, we continue to write, and even as you talked about the church, and some questions were raised as well. One thing I realize is, while the church must come with a confession and all of that, it must look within as well. Because on the one hand, we think that casteism is wrong, but on the other hand, we take much pride in our caste. It's, what do you say? Uh,
Status sort of.
identities and statuses. So there are many things that when we look within the church as well, we feel very sad, and we hope that by all of our conversations and the many things that we are trying to do, we will slowly try to influence others as well. So thank you, Dr. Philip, again for coming and sharing your thoughts with the Tracy community. Let's look to God in prayer. Father, we want to thank you again for this privilege of coming together as your children to look at the word and also the world around, and also as your church to be able to understand that our faith also means that we're actively involved in issues of justice, because you're a God of justice, and we should also be about justice at all times, Lord. Father, not just as we look at the world around us, but also within inside the church, we fall short in a lot of areas. And I pray that your spirit would continue to convict us, continue to move us in the direction where the church is truly the salt and light by all that it believes and in the way that it practices. We thank you for Dr. Philip and for his paper, for his work, and for the Reformed Church. I pray that you'd bless their work and their ministry, and that they will continue to influence people all around the world, and particularly the church, so that the church will truly be your church in this world. Thank you for this evening, and thank you for all our friends who've come together. And I pray that we would carry forward the things that we've learned, so that we will also continue to influence those around us. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.